Hi, I'm John Atack. I have to say this, Alan. And this is my good friend, Alan Scheflin, the eminent Alan Scheflin. And we're going to have a probably rambling conversation with any luck. And we share a tremendous fondness for the blues rock of the 1960s, the late 60s. And Alan, you knew Cream, you knew Eric Clapton and Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker and stuff like this. So all these people are going to be tuning in saying they want tips about how to sue people. And here we are talking about, well, let's start by talking about Buddy Guy. I sent you a clip of Jack Bruce, Buddy Miles, and
yes,
Buddy Guy from 1969, I think it was.
This was actually, the story is not a happy one.
Oh no!
With
I hope Buddy Guy survives it.
Oh yes, right. He did fine, but not that night. I knew who he was, and he didn't have that big a reputation at that time. But I had a friend, also named John, who turned me on to a lot of these different people. I had walked into a hippie-ish kind of record store in the Georgetown area of Washington, D.C., and we got into a discussion, and it turns out he was extraordinarily knowledgeable about music I'd never heard of. He was the one who told me, go across the street and listen to this guy named Roy Buchanan.
Yeah.
And that's how I first heard and later met Roy. But Buddy Guy was going to be playing in the basement of a church in Washington, D.C. And that was exciting because I wanted to hear that kind of, fervor from a gospel and church-oriented audience.
Yeah.
But I don't know what happened exactly. He kind of fumbled around for 10 or 15 minutes and then kind of mumbled, shook his head, unplugged his guitar and walked off, and that was the end of the show.
Oh dear.
Yeah, and so I'm a great fan of his music, but I was a little concerned, that maybe drugs had gotten him, because I think at that point he was a druggie.
He's certainly an advocate of champagne and reefer in the same way that Muddy Waters was, but I've no idea about what he was doing then. He's an astonishing character because he arrives in Chicago around about 1950 as a very young man. He has to take on 2 jobs to keep himself alive, and he's going into Chess Studios where Leonard Chess is using him as a session man, but he won't let him be a front man. So you get First Time I Met the Blues in about 1956, I think. That is the only early hit. Years later, when in 69, when Hendrix approaches him and says, I learned so much from you, and Buddy Guy says, I didn't get no check,
yes.
There's this acknowledgement, which I think we all now accept listening to the later Buddy Guy, that this guy can pretty much do everything that Hendrix did. And he's older than Hendrix. He's 7 years older than Hendrix. And yet, and he has a huge following, but he never made the mainstream sort of following that Hendrix made. Yeah. And as far as I know, he's still working, aged about 80, I got to him very late. My nephew saw him, and it was only about 5 or 6 years ago that I started digging into the catalogue of, the latest, from 1970 onwards after Hendrix's death.
Yeah.
And some just really, really, I kind of had Luther Allison as the benchmark for blues playing. And before him, probably Rory Gallagher. These were people you'd see if other people came up to that. Right. But I think Buddy Guy is probably the benchmark, really.
So there's no doubt about him being a great player. And when I was in Chicago, I went to his club.
Legends, yeah.
Yeah, and that was fun.
Yeah, I went there. I saw John Mayall there, and I'd never seen John Mayall, and I grew up on John Mayall, at the age of 11 or so. So it was great seeing him. He got Coco Montoya playing guitar, which is great. But he got this. I played drums. He got this really good drummer who was not playing what they were playing. He was showing off all the way, and it was. But so it goes.
That that reminds me, of how frustrated the band leader must be when that happens,
Mm.
and that some people, I think, Howlin' Wolf was one of them, used to fine band members who would not do what they're supposed to do.
Mm. I think there's a lot of it. Little Richard, James Brown. I've just watched the great movie Get On Up and the documentary that comes with it, Mr. Dynamite, both funded by Mick Jagger, and
Yeah,
with Chadwick Boseman playing, the late Chadwick Boseman playing James Brown.
yeah,
And all the way through, I'm going, wow, Chadwick Boseman, what a great voice, And at the end, you realise he's miming to James Brown songs. But yeah, the finding band members, and it used to be like there was a period in the 60s when there were only two swing bands still performing. One was Ellington's band, the other was Buddy Richards. And they were the two extremes that Ellington, in his whole career, only once sacked a musician, which was Paul Gonsalves, because Gonsalves went down to the ground, fell down to the ground while playing and came up playing a different song.
yeah,
And he was sacked and rehired the next day. Buddy
right,
Rich was, everybody was fined if your trousers weren't pressed properly, or what have you.
yeah.
Different. The authoritarian group leader,
Right, right.
but
Thank good for YouTube because we
ah,
can see some of these people in their prime in footage we never would have thought was imaginable.
no, it is. There's been it's a kind of renaissance. That I was very interested in Steve Marriott, the guitar player with and singer with the Small Faces, and then with Humble Pie,
Yeah,
and because I think he had one of the great soul voices. And you dip into YouTube, and there's all this film material of him from all over the place, and he had a terrible time of it because he never paid for the Small Faces material. Humble Pie with the biggest grossing touring band in the US. I think they were grossing more than Led Zeppelin for a year
mm,
or two, and yet he didn't get paid. And
yeah,
there's an album he released called "Lend Us a Quid," which was basically, I can't survive on this.
yeah,
That
yeah.
that album actually has three members of the King Crimson band in it,
Wow,
which I was quite fascinating. The rhythm section and saxophone player Mel Collins.
yeah,
A lot of good stuff. A lot of the Humble Pie, I think they were probably drinking too much, and it's just rock and roll. It's just the kind of innovative, clever lyrics that Ronnie Lane and he used to write for the Small Faces. There's none of that anymore. It's all songs about sex, and lots of vocal gymnastics, which I suppose he was brilliant at.
yeah.
Um, but yeah,
It's amazing to me, how fertile the music of America was in Britain.
yes, that the race music, so called, which had really, there was this confusion over Elvis for the first couple of years because people didn't know whether he was black or white. So he was on both the black and the white stations. But otherwise, black music was in one place and white music was another place. And Ray Charles had broken through, Nat King Cole before him, Nina Simone would. But there was blues music. It had sort of transformed into soul.
Yeah,
By the time it arrived in the UK, and people here Mick Jagger he was watching James Brown. He wanted to look like and sound like James Brown.
right.
Steve Winwood was watching Sam Moore of Sam and Dave. Jack Bruce was watching Ray Charles. They'd all got Peter Gabriel, later Otis Redding. With all of them, there's one great soul singer, and they're trying to get that. But something was imported from this down home gut bucket music in the middle classes of the home counties around London, and we got Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton, and a renaissance of the blues, which caused psychedelic music and so much else that happened, which meant that half the music that was successful in the US for a long time was coming from England.
Yeah, which is, kind of insane because I remember in those days before Amazon, before everything else, um, those of us who wanted to hear really great down home blues,
Mm.
had to get records from Japan, Germany, or England
Mm.
because there wasn't a whole lot of market in the United States for them
No.
until the late 60s.
Yeah, I mean, with the Stones coming over and recording at Chess, with Fleetwood Mac um, recording at Chess, with the
Yeah,
Beatles when they first arrived in Chicago, asked what they wanted to see, they said Bo Diddley and Muddy Waters, and their guide said, "I'm not familiar with those places,"
yeah.
and that was the ignorance of, you know, they again, you get it right back in the 30s when Duke Ellington first played in Paris in the 30s, and he gets off the aeroplane, and there's a line of French composers waiting to adulate this man who's used to
Yeah,
having to have his own train in the US because he can't stay in hotels in the South.
yes.
Armstrong got the same reception, of course. They're regarded immediately as heroes. Quite
Ha-
right.
ha- Have you watched the Ken Burns series Jazz?
I did, and here they cut it down to 10 hours. So I got the American version, which is 17 hours.
Yeah.
The BBC decided they could just trim 7 hours out of it. So yeah, I went and got the whole thing. Fantastic. I wish that it went on to what Miles did next, and the
Oh,
fusion of McLaughlin, Chick Corea, Weather Report. There's this sort of jazz aficionado thing that Wes Montgomery was the last thing that happened in jazz. Well,
yeah.
jazz is still moving. There are still things happening in
It's a just a magnificent document.
I
You
agree.
know? Unfortunately, in a way, it was happening at a time when a guy named John Adams was writing a history of jazz.
Mhm.
John was the music director for the PBS station here, um, out of
Which is
New York
public
City.
broadcasting. Yep.
Yeah. So what went on the air is and shows that needed music and so on. He took care of that,
Mm.
and his manuscript was much better than Ken Burns's.
Yeah.
Uh, not in terms of writing. The writer for the Ken Burns stuff is really great,
Mm.
um, but John knew more about that music than the people, and Quentin Marsalis, and
Mhm.
the people who were heavily relied on.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, Marsalis is one of the great trumpet players,
yeah,
and he's such an amusing, ebullient character to watch. Um,
absolutely.
what was it? Is it West End Blues, the Armstrong piece? And he plays it and says, "This is now what marks whether you can play the trumpet or not. Not,
Yeah, yeah.
whether you can play a trumpet voluntary from Mozart or something." Um,
See, I would have liked to have seen something on Lonnie Johnson
oh yes, me too. What an
because
important man.
yes, I mean Johnson becomes the in a way the first black guitar player to team up with a white guitar player who happened to be Bing Crosby's guitar player,
Eddie Lang.
Eddie Lang,
Yeah.
and they made some historic but unavailable for the most part recordings in the early days, and then you get Charlie Christian coming in later. I think it was with Benny Goodman's band, is
He was
or
with Benny Goodman's band, but he was also sitting in with Dizzy Gillespie and Burt Parker, and they create bebop. Unfortunately, of course, Charlie Christian only lives to be 21, and
yeah,
you've got this period where you've got him, you've got Oscar Moore playing with Nat King Cole, and T-Bone Walker, and they're the three original electric guitar players in 1941, and
yeah.
all extraordinarily competent.
'Cause, I mean,
So
in a way, it all starts with Lonnie Johnson.
I agree. He's
Who-
yeah,
Go ahead.
he's the first of the technical guitar players. When you look to Robert Johnson, who is a wonderful player, you're listening to Blind Lemon Jefferson plus Charlie Patton plus Lonnie Johnson, and that he could move so easily between the world of jazz and fairly straightforward blues, though he uses scales that are unusual in blues. And he just has such competence. He has a lovely voice too. Um, these people who were in their time stars, who are not really that much listened to. The original Sonny Boy Williamson, John Lee Sonny Boy Williamson,
Yeah.
Most people know of the man who stole his name, Rice Miller,
Right.
but they don't. Who's also brilliant, if somewhat unpleasant, if one listens to John
Yes.
Mayall's. He was a mean old man, but he could blow his horn. But when I finally, 25 years ago, came to John Lee Williams, it's like, this guy is incredible.
Yeah.
What a wonderful delivery, wonderful humor, and what a great harmonica player. And I guess they come and they go. That these things, as long as we promote them hard enough, will come back, and people will realize these were great moments. And Lonnie Johnson, I was very lucky. There are some Smithsonian recordings, um, which were put out on a label called Roots and Blues. And that's where I first heard Lonnie Johnson, again, about 25, 30 years ago.
Incredible player. And
Way beyond most of his contemporaries, yeah.
I highly recommend on YouTube. I think there may be a couple of different versions of a song called "Too Late to Cry."
Mm.
"Too Late to Cry." There's one version that I know of. I'd collected a bunch of versions of him doing the song that brings tears to your eyes. It's so achy, heartfelt. I hope it's there, and I hope you find it, and I hope you
Mm.
enjoy it.
Mm.
But
Absolutely.
Johnson surfaces again in the 1960s, where during the blues
Mm.
revival, they had an interest in discovering some of the precursors.
Yeah.
They found Johnson as a janitor in a hotel in Philadelphia. And he becomes resurrected and winds up being on tours and so on, and he's recording again.
Mm.
Um, and he's lost none of his talent in between the jazz stuff and early blues
Mm.
and the folk revival.
Yeah.
Uh, he was doing kind of middle of the road songs, but his voice was so wonderful and his playing was so wonderful. You just don't care. There was an Australian label whose name I have forgotten now, but which had a song, an album of his that was just lovely, and it had that music, that
Mm.
period kind of in between this kind of music and that kind of music.
Mm.
It was just kind of basic ballads and swaggy.
Yeah.
I think it was Swaggie, as I recall.
Swaggy. I'll look that out. Yeah, I mean, I go back to so many of those blues artists. I picked up Alan Lomax's the place where the blues was born the other day, which I haven't looked at for 20 years, and read the entry on Son House. And he's in, and Son House, as you know, and our audience may not, he's one of the little founding trio of the blues: Tommy Johnson, Charlie Patton, and Son House. They're all there in the same place. Howlin' Wolf, Chester Burnett is there. Robert Johnson is there. They're all
Yeah,
sitting around together.
yeah,
And Son House, whenever somebody talks to me about musical technique and the necessity of technique in music, I'm a big fan of John McLaughlin and lots of very competent people. But if you don't have passion to communicate, then the music will be sterile. And so I take them to I think it's a 1963 YouTube. It's on YouTube now. 1963 recording of Son House playing "Death Letter," where
yeah,
he's singing about, and you see him. He's not playing the guitar. He's kind of, it's a National steel, beautiful steel guitar. He's
yeah.
not playing it so much as damaging it. He's kind of
Yes, yeah.
hurting it. And you get
In today's world, abusing it.
yeah, and exactly what you're saying about "Too Late to Cry," Lonnie Johnson. It can't help but evoke a response in you, and remind you that K-pop is not all there is to life. That there is still music out there somewhere. Um,
I had an experience that I dearly miss, dearly miss. Um, it lasted about 10 years. where somehow or other a group of us found each other, and every month, once a month, we met at usually the same guy's apartment, and everybody was tasked with the responsibility to bring something that the others hadn't heard of any kind of music.
Mm.
And that's where I first heard Mongolian throat singers,
Yes.
and there was a lot of Bollywood stuff that some of them were into at that point in time. But I think the story you will enjoy the most is that one of the guys brought in a song and said, "I'm going to play it for you, but I'm not going to tell you right now who the artist is.
Mm.
You try to figure it out, and I'll let you know if you're right, and if not, I'll tell you the answer." So we put it on, and we pretty much determined that it was 1960s. It had a folksy feel to it, so it was clearly rooted into the folk, not quite yet folk rock
Mm.
tradition. It was a vocalist with guitar, and everything we guessed was wrong. And we finally said, "Okay, who is it?" He said, "I'll tell you who it is. Charles Manson."
Oh, right, the Beach Boys songs. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was very strange.
It's one of those things, isn't it? If Hitler had been able to make a career as an artist, and if Manson had been able to record songs,
That's right.
who knows what might have happened in the world. Oh,
Well, the Manson, the first killings were at the home of Terry Melcher,
yeah.
Doris Day's son, and Melcher was kind of accused by Manson as being one of the people who sabotaged Manson's, folk career.
Mm. And they got the wrong guy, didn't they? Because it was somebody else was living there, and they killed him instead. And that's the
Yeah.
only murder where Manson was actually present and struck a blow, if I remember rightly, the first one.
Well, there were two that I recall. One was an older couple.
Yeah.
The they were mutilations. I mean, it was really vicious.
Mm. Yeah. Not a nice man. I was surprised, and this takes us slightly off our topic, and we will return to it. There was many accolades for a biography of Manson that came out a couple of years ago. So I bought it, and I was staggered to see there was absolutely no mention of Scientology in it. Because in his autobiography, written with Noel Emmons, Manson straight out says, "I had 150 hours of Dianetic and Scientology processing, and that is what gave me the skill I needed to control people." We
Yeah.
also know from the seized documents in the FBI's raids on Scientology that two other members of the family had done Scientology as well. But
Yeah.
it's being written out of history at the moment. So still, let's get back to the music. We'll talk about the mind control some other time. I'm sure we will. You've told me about your meetings with the members of Cream, Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker, and the
Yeah.
project to make a band with Eric Clapton, the great guitar player Roy Buchanan, your friend, and with the rhythm section of the Beatles, Ringo and Macca. So elaborate upon that if you care.
The story was that certainly Jeff Beck was floored by Roy's playing. I mean, he
Wow.
very impressed.
Yeah.
And it is. I mean, Roy was doing stuff. If you go back in time to the '60s, where he wasn't recorded that much, and often not under his own name, he was doing things that were astonishing. He was the guitar player's, envy,
Mm.
and he worked little clubs. All the guitar players knew who he was, and they all went to steal licks.
Mm.
Um, and Roy had grown up in Bakersfield, where he had the influences of Roy Nichols, the Merle Haggard's guitar player, and that whole Bakersfield sound.
It's
Um,
where Frank Zappa and Captain Beefheart come from as well, Bakersfield.
I don't know for sure, but you know, it was a hell of a place to be at the time.
Yeah.
Buck Owens was there, and it was a center of vibrant music that ultimately exploded into a whole dimension of country and western music.
Mm.
And and Roy was very influenced by Roy Nichols, who was Merle Haggard's guitar player. And did you ever see the special on Roy?
No, I haven't. I must see that.
Um, oh gosh, I think it's called Introducing Roy Buchanan.
Yeah.
It was it was done by John Adams, who was the music director at the public broadcasting in New York, WNET. And it's available, I'm pretty sure, on Amazon.
Mm,
It,
excellent. I'll find it.
it's a history of him coupled with footage,
Mm,
of him playing.
mm.
And it was in the process of being filmed at the time I left Washington, D.C. to go to Los Angeles.
Mm.
And by the time I'd gotten to Los Angeles and so on, it had been done, and I watched it when it came out, and then got a copy from John Adams. It's okay. Uh, Roy is not that newsworthy a person. I mean, he's had those moments in his past where he was playing in some club and some owner said, you're a hippie or whatever, all that hair. And the next time Roy showed up, he had shaven his head and his eyebrows.
Just to make sure.
Yes, an unusual person.
Mm.
Um, but that whole music in that period of time, um, it just exploded. And John Adams had produced Roy and did this documentary. It's fun to learn about the family. His roots, of course, are in gospel music, and he used to play in churches. And so it's kind of half documentary and interview, and the other half playing. The playing is more subdued,
Mm.
and Niels Lofgren is in it because Niels was an up and comer in Washington D.C.
Mm.
I saw him when he was, I think, 16. At a party for guitar players, and it was clear Roy was a big influence, and that whole DC scene was a big influence because Link Ray was there.
Yeah.
And Rumble is, that that's the start of heavy metal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So find it, or if you have trouble, let me know.
Is there a Roy Buchanan album that you'd recommend to our viewers?
The second one, I don't remember the name,
We'll
but
find out.
I mean, they're all good to some extent. The problem is that people didn't know how to produce him.
Mm.
He was too different.
Mm.
He really was a barroom guitar player who wound up performing before stadiums, um, but it wasn't who he was. And some nights he was great. Some nights, he'd be a little off. And some nights you lost all your senses because he did things that were remarkable. And you knew it, and the audiences would gasp.
Yeah.
I mean, he was that good. Um, but he'd been on the road all of his life. He left home when he was about 15 or so.
Mm.
Uh, and he settled down. His wife Judy was an interesting woman. We stayed friendly after his death, and Roy would often say, "I can't live with her, and I can't live without her." But Roy was a handful. He would meet people and bring them home. Um, in fact, after his shows ended at 2 a.m. In Bladensburg, we used to go back to his house and talk and listen to music for a couple of hours. But the second album, it has a kind of a yellowish uh, cover. That one is really good, I think.
Dig that.
The first one was timid.
Mm.
Some good songs and so on, but it was timid.
Mm.
The second one was looser.
Mm.
The best thing I've heard never made it exactly onto an album. It was who was the bass player who turned producer?
There are a few of them. Felix Pappalardi?
No. Stanley Clarke.
Stan Clark, yeah, great player. I met Stan a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, Stanley recorded. It was the producer for one of Roy's albums, and he he did it, but he didn't really fully understand Roy's playing.
Mm.
And so one day Roy said, "Here," and gave me an audio tape. And when it was a jam between Roy and Steve Cropper. Yeah. And it winds up on the album. But the cut that Roy gave me was beyond astonishing. When Stanley got it in the studio, he softened it and lost its vitality. Mm. I mean, because one of the things Roy liked to do was play a song through, and then the next time around, he'd really jazz it up more. Mm. And the third time around, you were in space. Yeah. So Cropper, Roy played a solo. Cropper played a solo. And then Roy comes in with a single note that sustains. And you're fixated on this one note. But Clarke in the production lost the impact of that, unfortunately. So no album is truly great in the sense that it's definitive. The Live in Japan album is good because he was stronger.
Yeah.
But you get something good from all of the albums.
I'll look into them. It's there are so many guitar players. I wrote a piece I had a website in the noughties. The webmaster abandoned it in 2005, and it's been floating out there ever since. Wow. But I wrote just about my own passion for guitar players, and I think when I counted, I'd actually listed 149 tracks of amazing guitar players. There have been so many with and it has continued that we've been through a couple of generations since then. So we've got Kenny Wayne Shepherd or Johnny Lang. I'm very keen on Joe Bonamassa's work and the things that he's done with Beth Hart. And I think he has a great voice, but she has one of the great voices. I'd say that she gets beyond even Janis Joplin. And one wouldn't have thought there was anything beyond Janis Joplin, but Beth Hart on a good night. And she's now performed with Buddy Guy and with Jeff Beck and with various people. But Bonamassa put his band there and stepped back from the mic and is just playing. I think he has a really fine tone. It's just, how much of it is is left in our youth, that these are experiences that we had when we were mere children many decades ago. That
yes.
I still listening to, say, Mick Taylor playing guitar on Blues from Laurel Canyon by John Mayall, and that's still, there's one track with Peter Green on, or Hard Road, which Peter Green played on with John Mayall. Just, it's still wonderful. And these years later, as I said, I'm a drummer, but listening back, the musicianship is even better than I'd ever appreciated. So listening to Ainsley Dunbar's playing on Hard Road.
I thought, oh, sorry,
Colin Allen is amazing on Blues from Laurel Canyon.
I was really pleased with Mick Taylor's playing with the Rolling Stones.
Yeah, he really picked them up, didn't he?
Right. And I thought Ron Wood was a step back.
Oh, definitely. And both of them had the same problem, which was heroin. And I mean, Ron Wood is a really competent rhythm guitar player, as is Keith Richards. And Keith Richards has to be one of the great melody writers of the generation, more than 50 great songs.
Yeah.
But neither of them have. Taylor is a really astonishing blues guitar player. But in the end, the mix of the celebrity and the heroin got him. And I saw him in 2004. And he played with a guy I came to know, Jules Fothergill, who sadly is no longer with us. And they were playing on the same stage as Colosseum, who were in a revival, and Jack Bruce, who had Gary Moore and Gary Husband playing for him. Now, Gary Husband is one of my favourite drummers, and I was really annoyed that they couldn't hear him because Gary Moore was so loud. It was like having a cheese wire pulled through your head. But on that night, Mick Taylor and Jules Fothergill played, and they were both something to see. Still all there. They're not quite as slim as he used to be when he was with the Rolling Stones, but it's still play guitar. So go ahead.
It's wonderful because it brings back so many memories. That I was at the Keystone Berkeley. The Keystones were kind of blues clubs or rock and roll clubs or music clubs, and there was one in San Francisco and one in Berkeley, and there might have been others. Those are the only two I really had paid attention to. And one night, Bobby Boobland was going to be playing. Do you know him?
No.
Bobby Blue Bland?
Oh, Bobby Bland.
Yeah.
I do, yeah.
Okay. Because he's a must.
Yeah.
He had two phenomenal guitar players. Wayne Bennett was one, the other one I'm blocking on now, but and he's in this. The Keystone was a relatively small club, and you could stand kind of right up at the where they're playing and the bandstand and look up, and I don't know how many black women with handkerchiefs were moaning and writhing as Bobby was crooning to them with this exquisite guitar playing in the back. Because he had phenomenal bands, and his voice was very romantic. He's definitely worth listening to.
It's been a while. I do have one of his albums somewhere, but there's just too much of it. They should stop making music. There's too much of it. There's too much. I can't keep up. And I'll find myself wondering. It's like I have to have everything that Ray Charles did, everything that I'm a completist.
Yeah.
And you'll find just these little bits and pieces in it. I was thinking when you were talking about the emotional effect of some music, I was thinking about Josh White, and there's a song called Little Brother, which is about his knife, a sharpened. And one of the stories with him, he later I think Kennedy gave him a presidential award, but he in the morning would go into the studio as the singing Christian, and then in the afternoon he'd be singing about his knife.
Right.
Which was not that unusual during the late 20s and 30s. And you're talking about blues artists who came back. And I was going to say Son House, when he's interviewed by Alan Lomax, he says, "Oh well, I'm too old to play the blues now." And so Lomax says to him, "How old are you?" And he said, "Oh, I'm 39 now," because 20 years later he'd be back again in the 60s, along with people like, say, Skip James, who his story is that he recorded a batch of songs in 1928. The Depression happened, no more recordings. He went back to being a petty gangster, and then he's in hospital having had surgery for, I think, he'd had a heart attack.
Yeah.
And he's got no idea how he's going to pay the bills. And suddenly this check for $10,000 arrives in his bank account because Cream have recorded I'm So Glad.
Yeah.
And unlike Led Zeppelin, they paid the royalties to the writers of the songs, you know.
Eric told me that they originally intended to be a Dada band, as he put it, and that songs like Wrapping Paper, sort of on the first.
More like the Bonzo Dog Dada band as it originally was. That they'd
Yes.
be, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Wrapping Paper is a very, or Anyone for Tennis, these anomalous little
Right.
half pop songs.
Yeah. They soon decided that wasn't what they wanted to do.
No, and thank God, and nobody ever came close to what they did do. There's an interview with Jack Bruce where he explains that that they never told Eric that he was Ornette. That he and Ginger were basically being the backing band for Ornette Coleman, and they were playing jazz. And so when bands like Mountain tried to emulate that Cream sound without very competent jazz musicians in the back line, you can't do it. And of course the African beat that Phil Seamans had taught to Baker, and that Baker made so much more of than Seaman. You know, I've never been able to find Seamans playing the African beat. I know Baker says that's where it came from. And Jack Bruce, of course, just one of the most competent musicians in history. What an amazing thinker and writer. And you've got things like the album he made with John McLaughlin and I think John Heisman, Things We Like, which was a solo album during Cream, and they're pieces that he wrote when he was, I think, 11 or something.
Yeah, he was easy to talk to, and his excuse me, his desire to make really great music was quite clear, and his dedication to the music was clear, and you can see the joy in his playing. I think he was abused by Ginger Baker, but
I think everybody was abused by Ginger Baker, yeah. I mean, the story is that when they're in the Graham Bond organization together, Bruce thinks that it was because he just refused to carry a double bass round anymore and insisted on using a bass guitar. And Baker was, "Oh, I don't like that." And one night, Baker comes up to him with a knife and says, "You're no longer in the band." And Jack Bruce says, "It's Graham Bond's band." And Baker says, "Do you want to argue about it?" And the next thing you know, a year or two later, Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker are talking about forming a band, and Clapton says, "I'll only do it if you can get Jack Bruce." And Baker's got to, and they were at each other's throats.
Yeah,
all three of them abusing heroin and alcohol. And Eric Clapton's stuck in the middle between this constant fight for 2 years between Bruce and Baker. And Baker was a horrible human being. The movie Beware of Mr. Baker makes it very clear, where he pokes the filmmaker in the eye with a stick in the end. So.
And the person who turned Eric into a drug addict, oh, that's interesting. Buddy Guy.
Really?
Heroin.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because certainly Baker had long had the habit, because he picked it up from Phil Seamans when Phil Seamans said, "Whatever you do, don't do this." So he went off and got some. And Bruce had the problem. So I mean, I didn't know anything about Buddy Guy and heroin. I presume that it's not a problem that he's had for a long time. Is that with Keith Richards, he gets exasperated with people and said, "I quit in 1980." You stop saying that. But so, did Eric Clapton tell you this? How did this information come to you?
I'm not sure I remember exactly how, but um, it might have come through Roy's manager,
Mm.
they were trying to put this super group together. Um, uh, it would have been a super group. I don't know that the personalities would have gotten along, but you know, Eric, I think, would have been accommodating.
Mm.
I couldn't get Eric to go see Roy. Um, that was, I'm not surprised at that, but I'm kind of disappointed it didn't happen.
Mm.
Uh, Cream was playing in Baltimore, and not that far away, half an hour, 40 minutes at the most, was a club where in Bladensburg, Maryland, where Roy was playing. And John Gossage, who was the photographer, and John was a musician, a guitarist, were talking to Eric about Roy, and Roy at that point hadn't hit the national scene, but he had recorded with Dale Hawkins
Yeah.
and with other people in the earlier years. And Eric had said, "Well, what did he play on?" And we told him the Dale Hawkins stuff, uh, and I didn't want to push Eric, that you really have to see him, because he hears that everywhere he goes.
Mm. Of course.
Right, and I figured, well, you'll eventually hear him. But they wanted to. The reason the band didn't come together was because of Eric then being on drugs.
Yeah, very specifically heroin.
Yeah.
And I mean, what did happen is blind faith, for
Do you
which
know? Do you know Danny Gatton, about Danny Gatton?
no.
Okay. Danny is somebody you should hear.
Mm.
Um, Maybe introduction to him would be the Humbler CD. Uh,
Okay.
but there also there's brilliance on all of his CDs. He kind of was a Holiday Inn guitar player. Hold on a sec. Yeah. Hi. My bride is back.
Good.
Um, it was. I have to get my train of thought back
Danny
now.
Gatton, Holiday Inn guitar player.
And yeah, and he played some country and western kind of music, and came to the DC area. Link Ray was there, Roy was there, and a bunch of other players were there, and became interested in that music and started playing exactly like Roy, with maybe a little bit more country in his playing, but um, he was an extraordinary technician
Mm.
and could play anything.
Mm.
He committed suicide a while back. Yeah, it was unexpected, um, but his playing, I found his playing to be less soulful
Mm.
than um, than Roy's.
Yeah.
More of a technician
Yeah.
than a true artist.
Mm.
But his ability to play guitar was, he could have cut anybody.
Mm.
And because his style was similar to Roy's, they had a friendly antagonism. They somebody thought, one, you put them both in a band, no, nobody would ever try to cut them.
Mm. That's what you got with Santana when Neil Schon was taken in, and it said that the rest of the band hired Schon, who was about 15 or something, and
Yeah,
he just there at rehearsal, and Santana was furious. And you listen to them on Caravanserai, the fourth and really final Santana album, I suppose is Borboleta, but and you've got these incredible guitar solos that are really blissful and euphoric, and then you find out they're they're trying to outdo each other. That's what's pushing them. It's actually antagonism that you're hearing, not joy, you know.
Yeah.
Great album.
But you get that great music when you have people in cutting contests and
Yeah.
doing, and you know, that's there's a friendliness about that give and take, call and response.
Yeah. It's not like the rap battles that we see between hip hop artists where they're trying to destroy each other. No.
Well, you know, a confession of my own ignorance that my paying attention to contemporary music kind of stopped in the 70s because I thought the raw feeling that had existed up until then went away in favor of more slickly produced, more commercially marketed bands.
Yeah.
There were great bands and great players. I like Dire Straits and um, and others, but I stopped really listening and found myself going backwards.
Hmm.
You know, who influenced you? You know, well, then who influenced that person? And so my musical tastes went backwards in time rather than forwards. But this group that I belonged to, where people brought in this music, kept me current because there was all kinds of things that people brought in that you couldn't possibly imagine existed as music.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I've recently read, it's a booklet that comes with the King Crimson box set Epitaph. And what they did was they went back to the original King Crimson, which only existed between April and December 1969. They produced the Court of the Crimson King. They backed the Stones at Hyde Park that year. They played the Fillmore East and the Fillmore West. They were astonishingly successful. And then the band fell apart. Greg Lake went off to Emerson, Lake and Palmer and into decline from my point of view.
Yeah.
And Ian MacDonald and the astonishing Mike Giles, the drummer, just didn't want to do it anymore. So Robert Fripp was left holding the baby. But he, in writing about this period, they found all of the live, tiny little bits of live recording. One of them from a cassette player in the audience, you know, and mastered them up. This guy, I think, called David Singleton, got them up so you can actually listen to them. And then wrote about this period. And Fripp says something which I think is interesting. He says, at the beginning of 1969, we were an underground band. By the end of 1969, we were a progressive band.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that, and he says he doesn't believe they were ever a progressive band. They were just people doing what they were doing. They weren't like Yes or Genesis or these other bands. They were just interested in a wider range of music. So they were listening to, particularly they played Gustav Holst's piece Mars from the Planets, and his widow refused them permission for their arrangement of it. So they sneaked it in. They put it into a piece on the second album. But yeah, they looked back to that music because they were trained classical musicians who were coming to rock music. So rather than coming out of jazz or blues into this place, but that notion of an underground, that as pop music became ever more slick, as you say, through the 80s, the synthesizer dominates and things just become unlistenable to from, you know, it's Duran Duran and Bon Jovi and Spandau Ballet and things that, you know, the only band in that time I can listen to is Japan, who I think were really quite innovative and had interesting squeaky noises, you know. But there was then an underground that's persisted, that's not prog, that's not necessarily jazz. And there are musicians who've never sold much. And the guitar player that I'm thinking of, who is one of my absolute heroes, who you may not know because of this, is Alan Holdsworth.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And I saw him in 1978. And I went back and saw the band 2 nights later at a different venue because I was so astonished by the facility of this man and that he just seemed to do something that was entirely his, that, you know, he used scales that he devised. He had a technique that was profound and unusual. He also had a compositional strength. But he fell between two stools because jazz musicians would say, well, this is rock music, and rock musicians would say, well, this is jazz. And so
Yeah.
never, you had a hardcore following of people like me, but never anything beyond that. But he had soul in his playing. He also had, he's not, wasn't formally trained. You'd think that he was, but apparently he learned how to do this. One moment in history was where Michael Jackson's Beat It came out, and you've suddenly got this incredible guitar solo. And the story behind it is that Eddie Van Halen had actually got, I immediately went, that's Holdsworth. Eddie Van Halen had actually paid for Holdsworth to live in his house and teach him for several months. So it does have that feel. The single itself was, I think Steve Lukather wrote the thing. Quincy Jones took it to Eddie Van Halen and didn't say anything about Michael Jackson. There were no vocals on it. And he plays that solo, and then Jackson puts the vocals on. So, you know, sometimes that little underground sound emerges in the pop world, but
Yes.
not that often.
I was just looking over here, but I'm not finding. I'll have to do more of a search. When we were talking about Ray Charles, they put together this big anthology of the best, but they missed something. And I don't know whether it's on YouTube. It was on an LP. I don't think it ever got made into a CD. I'm not sure. I think the title was something like From Newport to New York, because it was the recording of a festival held in New York. And there's a song that Ray Charles did, and I guess they didn't anthologize it because they probably didn't have the rights to include it, called Just a Man. Just a Man. And it's kind of an autobiographical song with an exquisite, yearning kind of vocal and magnificent guitar solo. But if you want to collect the best of Ray Charles and want to get from sources that we don't all know, that's the one to get. If I can find it, because I things when we moved, everything's been a mess. I'll find a way to get it to you.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, in the Ray Charles back catalogue, I've never been able to get a copy of Crying Time, which is the album he made after his second bust for heroin, where it was explained to him that he would go to prison for the rest of his life if he was caught again, and he moved to alcohol instead. So he'd have an half alcohol coffee mix all day.
Yeah.
And Crying Time is said to be, you know, this, the song Crying Time is, you can find elsewhere. It's Crying Time Again, I Have to Leave You. You have to leave me. I see that far off look in your eye, whatever. But the album is meant to be his grief over not being able to take heroin. It's kind of love songs about heroin. But everything leading up to it, and most of the releases, you know, the country and western modern sounds, you know, where you got this anomaly that he goes to the record label and says, I want to do country and western songs, and they say it'll never sell. Johnny Cash went to his record label and said, I want to do gospel songs, and they said it'll never sell. They're their biggest selling albums.
Right.
Because it was a music, there were musics they loved and weren't meant to love in the stereotypes, you know.
There's a vocal group called the Original Sing Band. Original Sing Band, or the Jones Boys. They went under a number of different names.
Okay.
And if it's available on YouTube, the one to listen to is Mr. Ghost Goes to Town. Have you ever heard that?
I don't believe I have.
Mr. Ghost Goes to Town.
I have a note. Yep.
Now, the Sing Band was a group ranged from maybe 4 to 10 people, various incarnations of the band. and one of their specialties was making their voices sound like instruments.
Aha.
So instead of a trumpet, someone go and um, and they were fabulous. And this song has a phenomenal rhythm. Just makes you tap your foot, and they execute it perfectly. Um, Mr. Ghost Goes to Town.
Ghost Goes Down. Do you know Bobby McFerrin's version of Sunshine of Your Love?
Oh, I think I've heard. Yes,
Which is
the
all
yes,
body
is
noises, no instruments. And he
yeah,
plays the
yeah.
guitar solo, I think, by going through a guitar effect, but he gets absolutely that fuzz tone of the guitar.
Did you did you ever have access in Britain to um, Bob Dylan's radio shows?
No,
Ooh,
made when? I mean, there's an album that calls itself Bob Dylan's Radio Show, which I do have, but they're not actually radio shows. They're him putting them together. And then there's his collection of gospel, which is dreadful
yeah,
during his Christian period. Are these actual radio shows that he produced, or?
yes, they were. They were. He was kind of the disc jockey,
Mm.
and there were 100 shows.
Oh wow!
Each one of them each one was an hour, as I recall, and each one had a theme.
Mm.
So the theme would be weather, or baseball,
Mm.
or rain, uh,
Ice cream. Oh.
and he would find songs reflecting that theme.
Mm.
But he had an encyclopedic notion of music. I mean,
Oh yeah.
and the stuff he would find is stuff was just glorious. I don't understand. Maybe somebody has put out the series. If they haven't done that, that's a sin against nature.
Mm. It happens.
And I highly recommend it, especially because he caught me by surprise. Uh, he had a version of Mr. Ghost Goes to Town.
Mm.
This was by a Western swing band.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, the version that's done by the black group is perfect. Why would you want anybody else to do it? But these guys with a Western swing um, approach to it do a phenomenal job also.
Mm.
And the thing about the Dylan show was that if you paid attention, just didn't sit and listen, um, but learned about these people, his exposure was across the entire musical spectrum. And I suspect that part of his desire was to get people to broaden their musical horizons. Um, and so, if you can track any of that stuff down, there won't be an episode of it you wouldn't fully enjoy.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, it is endless. My collection includes North Indian ragas, South Indian Pahlavis, Japanese music, Chinese music,
Yeah.
Aborigine music, whale song.
Yes.
But I go right back to the music of the Middle Ages, Leonin and Peritin from the 11th century and come on up through the Renaissance, Baroque, classical. There is so much, there is the wealth there is impossible. And there's a thing, Lao Tzu said that other people grow wiser every day, but I grow more foolish. And I feel that way, that when I was 18, I probably knew 1% of all the knowledge in the world. And now at the age of, I'll be 66 in 2 weeks, I know about a millionth of 1%, realizing, oh, thank you. Not quite yet, but you can sing me a song when the time comes.
It'd be my pleasure.
Excellent.
If I were you, I wouldn't listen. There's a reason I never fronted a rock group.
Fair enough. That is fair enough. We probably better sort of slowly wind this up, really, that and we must do it again, because I'm sick and tired of talking about, you know, mind control and all of that stuff, and you must
Yes,
be
this has
too.
been a delightful respite from that.
Yeah, and doubtless we will go back to talking about that, because that's what we do. So this has been a ramble through our musical interests, many of which are mutual.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me sad that we don't live in the same town.
Yeah, well, thankfully we have Zoom, but yeah, it would be nice to come around and poke through your record collection. And but
Because maybe sometime, um, if you're interested, I'll find the Ray Charles song and play it for you or whatever,
I'd
because
love to. Yeah, I
it
love
just
Ray
is
Charles.
exquisite.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, I think there are a few people who they just really stand out. So, you know, I grew up listening to all of the rock music that was available. So I was listening to the Stones when I was about 8, and the Beatles and the Kinks and the Who and the Small Faces and Traffic and Cream and Jimi Hendrix. And it it's inevitable. You say, you know, great electric guitar. It's like you're talking about classical guitar. You say Segovia, you know, and you might come to derivatives, but Segovia is where you start. And with electric guitar, Hendrix is so influential. But then you look back and go, well, look, Nina Simone, who else has there ever been? Or Brother Ray, or Louis Armstrong, Pops. You know, there are these individuals who gifted something so profound to the world. And their influence stretches out. Then you start going, well, who else can play the guitar? And you end up
Yeah,
with a list of 200 or 300 people, you know, because
exactly.
people are good. But,
Uh,
well,
uh, and aside from sounding like an elitist, um, I'll put that over here. So much of the music that the general public is exposed to, in my view, is so awful. You know, that I could never understand why you would settle
mm,
simply because it was there.
mm,
And that was reinforced by a documentary I saw on one of the public broadcasting stations called Airplay about the rise of the radio disc jockeys.
yeah,
And those radio disc jockeys were quite extraordinary. And they program Alan Freed was one, of course,
of course. Yeah.
and they programmed their own music.
Mm,
Um, but when they became popular as celebrities and could command higher salaries, and various conservative forces in society started to object to what they were playing, um, the money people came in. They changed the format to what's called top 40,
yeah. Playlist
the
music. Yeah.
playlist. So that way it didn't matter who you got as the DJ, and everybody played the same music, and it had to be music that was not offensive to anybody,
Mm,
which made it offensive to me.
absolutely. Because the problem is that when you're playing to a conservative audience, then you will restrict what goes on. And it's something about the movement. I think this is a really important topic. It's something about the movement of um, African American music into the American mainstream. And it's not, you know, there's Hawaiian music, and you know, when we look at it, Charlie Patton wasn't in fact a black man. He was part black and part Choctaw, as Hendrix was part Cherokee. There are all sorts of cultures. Hendrix was also part Irish, which is another possible source for the blues. But what's significant is I was listening to Mississippi Fred McDowell this week, and you know he says I actually come from Tennessee, but no mind, Mississippi Fred McDowell, and he's the last bluesman to be discovered, and he's playing this raw music that he's never earned any money for doing, and
Right.
it's, you know, money tends to corrupt, absolute money, absolutely so. That so this astonishing, wonderful music becomes hitched to commercial interests and
Right.
predatory people who have no souls whatsoever. You know,
Right.
looking at the James Brown, both in Mr. Dynamite and the movie Get On Up, the producer is saying, this isn't a song. He's just saying, please. He just keeps saying, please, this isn't a song. We can't do this. And his deputy pleads with him, please release this. And there it is. You get it, that this pure, raw emotion has a meaning. But as soon as these people who have no souls can get their hands on it and try and monetize it, they will do everything they can to eviscerate it and make it bland and pap-filled. And it happens in all of the arts. But, thankfully, there is such creative genius in human beings that a few of them manage to keep going and produce something despite the situation. And occasionally you'll get somebody who comes to control, like say Paul McCartney. I had a long period of despising Paul McCartney for Wings, and a lot of us went, it's John Lennon, he's the cool one. He imagined that £150,000 piano that he was playing on. That's the only way it can come and imagine no piano. But I came back to McCartney about 5 or 6 years ago and went, oh, he's actually incredibly good. And I went back through the post-Wings catalogue from about 1980 onwards, and he has produced, 25 or so phenomenal albums because he has control of what he does now. Nobody is going to tell him what to do with £800 million in the bank. David Bowie is another example of somebody who took control of his own oeuvre, having started with his first single was Can't Stop Thinking About Me. He also released The Laughing Gnome before Space Oddity and A Brief Period of Fame. But he eventually took control of what he was doing musically. And I think so many of the bands don't actually have anything to take control of. They have no, gut bucket profound feelings, and the industry cleans them out along the way. So I think one of the great things about the internet is that bands have been able to come through with no record label. So the Arctic Monkeys were actually a million-selling band without a record label. I don't like their music, sadly, but it's like Emmanuel Macron proving that you can win an election and most of the seats with a brand new political party. It's just a shame that it's a crap political party, but it shows it can be done. And so there is hope for the world. And the same musically, that now we are seeing some new energy in music.
I'll take your word for it.
Well, I have two lads in my house who are it, so I see it every day with my son, 16 and 19, producing music that, it was amazing to me. I can remember going to a record store in the 1980s and getting a reduced price King Crimson vinyl album and taking it to the desk, and the kid who was only 19 behind the counter going, oh, lovely, fantastic band. I'm going, you're not meant to, this is old people's music. You're not meant to listen to this, this is 10 years ago. And then finding, I have a son who is 16 and a virtuoso guitar player. And I listened to all sorts of things. He dug straight into what I used to listen to in the 60s and found it without me telling him. So he went through Hendrix, he went through Peter Green, he went through Santana, Terry Kath with Chicago, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and just found out how they made those noises.
Right.
And is now, he's very influenced by Hendrix's sort of guitar layering that you hear in Cry of Love, or First Rays of the New Rising Sun, as it was retitled. Those last things that Hendrix was working on, where he's putting one guitar track over another. And nowadays you just need a computer and GarageBand and you can do it at home. So I am hopeful that music will survive the capitalist machine,
I envy your optimism.
Well, I will, it's contagious, believe me. I will spread it to you, but we will do that with music, and maybe before the next time we meet, I can introduce you to a few of the things that I'm listening to that are happening now.
That would be great. Yeah, because I'm not thinking of music in particular, but I'm thinking of everything in general. and that is, I think, the dollar has ruined everything it's touched.
Yeah.
And the watching what's happening with television now, that the people who know nothing other than how to build up their bank accounts make decisions about what our taste should be, and it's left to the rest of us to discover what's left of authenticity, because that doesn't always make as much money. But
No, and the tendency is for pap and you know useless sludge. Though having said that, television production has come on, and we've seen. I think that Shakespeare would be watching things like 6 Feet Under, or The Wire, or Patriot. That's my current favorite. I'm rewatching Patriot for the fourth time, which is a comedy show about the CIA, but it's so elaborate and clever. Or Boston Legal, there was a great show about the law. So somehow these things come through and they find some audience. And movies. I mean, I'm watching Ma Rainey's Black Bottom at the moment, again with
right,
Boseman,
yeah,
and so it some American Beauty. Occasionally great movies can be made despite this commercial thing, and maybe there's something in the future because the tools of production have come into the hands of the proletariat now. I have my own camera.
right, right,
I have
right.
sound recording equipment. Um, one of the people, many people I absolutely love, Fiona Apple. She made her last album, Fetch the Bolt Cutters, at home using GarageBand on her computer, and it's CD quality. She had a bit of a problem because she couldn't work out how to erase things. So there are points where her dogs are barking and things, but it all
Right,
just helps. So I think that the cottage industry, even in movie making, that you can make a movie with 2 iPhones now. That we will see. It's finding our way into that place. So, which is more likely to be on Vimeo than on mainstream TV. Where you
right.
can, for example, see Arthur Cortey's documentaries on Vimeo, which are beautiful little 10-minute pieces with cinematography that Bertolucci would have liked. So it is happening. So now, have I passed some of my enthusiasm over to you now?
Yes, I hope so. Well, we can't live without enthusiasm and optimism.
Nice.
So, that's, but we also have to help create making it legitimate.
Yeah.
I wanted to, you mentioned Paul McCartney,
Hmm.
and it reminded me of a story I think that you might enjoy. It was the first time that I knew I was old. The scene is Berkeley, California, a record store called Rather Ripped Records, run by two friends of mine who just loved music, and I know I could always find something there that they would would know about that I didn't. So I used to hang out with them a lot, and I was over there one day. This is probably in the 1980s, and I'm talking to one of the owners, and there are two teenage girls come in, and one of them holds up an LP and says, "Look, Paul McCartney was in a band before Wings, and the album was the Beatles." I knew the torch had passed to
Yeah.
the next generation.
Yeah. And oh well, so it goes, eh?
Right.
We thankfully, have this thing that wine gets better as it gets older, and we don't necessarily get older by whining, but we can give it a shot. So anyway, this has been just what an incredible pleasure talking to you, Alan.
Well, you too. Yeah, I'm amazed at whatever. Well, the time that's gone by, but I'm sure we can do this on a number of topics.
Yeah, let's do that. I'm going to switch off the recorder now. So I'm John Atack. This is my great good friend Alan Scheflin, and we thank you very much for your time and attention. And we hope you enjoy listening to some of the things that we've talked about, because they're great things. And
we enjoyed talking about them.
yeah, we've enjoyed ourselves, which is the main thing, frankly.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Thanks a lot.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.